In the heart of Wyoming, where winter never seems to end and the wind carries whispers through the pines, one man thought he had lost everything. But on the coldest night of his life, a faint cry in the storm would change everything he believed about love, loss, and miracles. This is the story of Michael Grant, a man who went into the snow to save a dying German shepherd and discovered that sometimes it's the ones we rescue who end up saving us. Tell us where you're watching from in the comments, and stay with us until the end, because what happened in Granite Hollow will warm even the coldest heart. Granite Hollow, Wyoming, was a town that barely breathed during winter. The snow came early that year, thick, relentless, and endless, as if the heavens had forgotten to stop pouring their frozen tears. Every roof bowed beneath the weight of white silence, and even the mountains seemed to hold their breath. In a small valley at the edge of the forest, an old wooden cabin stood half buried under snowdrifts. Inside lived Michael Grant, a man who had once run toward disasters, not away from them. Michael was 45, tall, broad-shouldered, his frame hardened by years in the mountain rescue service. His face, rugged and lined, looked as though the wind itself had carved it from stone. His eyes, steel gray and watchful, were the kind that had seen too much and trusted too little. After his wife Eleanor died in a car accident 2 winters ago, something inside him froze harder than the Wyoming ground. Since then, he'd spoken more to the silence than to people. The radio stayed off. The phone line was dead. His only companion was the ticking clock and the crackle of firewood he split himself every dawn. That night, the storm came like an uninvited god. The wind screamed through the pine trees, rattling shutters and lifting plumes of snow that blurred the world into a white oblivion. Michael had been sitting by the fire, sharpening his old rescue knife, a habit he could never quite give up, when he heard it. A sound so faint, he thought at first it was the wind's trick. Then it came again. A cry, thin, desperate, and not human. He rose, muscles stiff, grabbed his coat and flashlight, and stepped into the storm. The cold hit him like a wall, biting through his gloves. The beam of his flashlight cut a narrow tunnel through the blizzard. Probably a coyote, he muttered, though something in his chest told him otherwise. The cry came again, sharper this time, half a whimper, half a plea. He followed the sound down the slope behind his cabin, where the forest thickened and the snow rose to his knees. Each step crunched through the crusted ice. Branches snapped in the gale above. Then, through the veil of snow, he saw it, a dark shape thrashing weakly near a fallen log. When he came closer, his stomach clenched. It wasn't a coyote, it was a dog, a German shepherd female, caught in an old rusted steel trap buried under the snow. The cruel metal teeth had clamped around her front leg, the fur matted with blood and ice. Beside her, 3 tiny pups, no more than a few weeks old, huddled together, trembling, their coats thin and slick with melting snow. "Easy, girl," Michael murmured, kneeling beside her. His voice, rough from years of disuse, softened for the first time in months. The dog's golden brown eyes lifted to his. They were full of pain, but not fear, only trust, as if she already knew this stranger meant her no harm. He inspected the trap, fingers numb. The steel was old, weather-eaten, but still deadly strong. "Someone out here's got no soul," he growled. From his belt, he drew his rescue knife, the same one that had cut ropes and seatbelts and, once, the twisted wreckage of a helicopter crash. With careful precision, he wedged the blade into the hinge, twisting until the rusted latch gave way with a metallic snap. The dog whimpered but didn't pull away. When the trap finally released, she collapsed, breathing fast. Michael tore a strip from his scarf, wrapped her bleeding leg tightly, then gathered the pups into his coat. They squirmed weakly, their small hearts fluttering like trapped birds. "Hang on, sweetheart," he whispered, slipping one arm under the dog and lifting her against his chest. She was heavier than she looked, muscle and bone, built for strength, but her body felt fragile now, trembling from cold and pain. He trudged back toward the cabin through the gale, snow blinding him, boots sinking deep. Each breath burned. Behind him, the storm howled like the sea. Inside the cabin, the fire had nearly died. Michael kicked the door shut, laid the dog on an old wool blanket by the hearth, and added fresh logs. The flames caught, spilling golden light across the room. He found his emergency kit, a habit from his rescue days, and cleaned the wound as best he could. The dog shivered but stayed still, her eyes following every motion. Her fur, once black and tan, was dulled by grime and frost, but beneath it he could see her strength. Even hurt, she carried a quiet dignity, the bearing of an animal born to protect. Michael spoke softly as he worked, words he hadn't spoken aloud in months. "You're one tough girl. You must have fought hard for those babies." The pups, 3 of them, one sable gray, one black, one with a pale streak down its nose, crawled closer to their mother, pressing against her belly. He fetched an old pan, warmed milk on the stove, and spoon-fed them drop by drop. The smallest, the one with the white streak, was the boldest. Its eyes opened first, its tiny paws pawing at the spoon. Michael chuckled, a sound that startled even himself. "You little fighter." Then, glancing back at the mother, he added softly, "You all deserve names." But names could wait. First came survival. He stoked the fire higher, hung his soaked coat by the door, and sat cross-legged near the animals. Outside, the storm battered the cabin, but within, the room filled with the sound of breathing, 4 heartbeats beside his own. He watched the mother carefully. Every rise of her chest was slow but steady. When he reached to touch her head, she leaned weakly into his hand. "You're safe now," he said. "You're not alone." For a long time, he just sat there, the flames painting his weathered face in shades of gold and shadow. Memories flickered in his mind, the accident, the empty house, the funeral where no words could thaw his grief. He had promised himself he'd never care again, never open his heart to anything that could die. But now, as the storm screamed outside and the creatures slept beside him, that promise began to crumble. He leaned back, feeling the warmth seep into his bones. The dog stirred, opening her eyes once more. They met his, full of silent gratitude. "Nova," he whispered, the word slipping out before he could stop it. "That's your name. A new star." As if she understood, Nova's tail thumped weakly against the blanket. The pups twitched, dreaming, tiny paws paddling in the air. The fire crackled, sending sparks into the chimney. Outside, the blizzard began to ease. The howling faded into a low hum, like the tired sigh of a world finally at rest. Michael rose to check the window. Through the frost-glazed glass, he could see nothing but the soft, white curtain of snow settling over the trees. The forest looked peaceful now, as though the storm had been nothing more than a test. When he turned back, Nova had lifted her head slightly, watching him. Her breath came out in visible puffs of steam. "You're a survivor," he murmured. "Maybe that makes 2 of us." He added another log to the fire and sat again, exhaustion pulling at his eyes. Nova's pups snuggled closer to her, their small bodies glowing orange in the firelight. For the first time in years, Michael felt something move inside him. Not sorrow, not regret, but the faint warmth of purpose. The cabin, once a tomb of silence, now pulsed with life. The crackle of fire, the soft whimper of pups, the rhythmic breathing of a dog who refused to die. When the last ember dimmed to red, Michael whispered a quiet prayer, not one of asking, but of thanks, for the strange mercy that had led him out into the storm. And as the wind softened outside, he lay down beside the hearth, the dogs close by, and let the night take him, not in grief, but in peace. The storm passed. The light of dawn would come soon. Somewhere in the distance, a bird called, a promise of morning. Morning came late to Granite Hollow, the kind of morning that didn't so much rise as crawl out of the snow. Pale light spilled weakly through frost-rimmed windows, revealing the cabin in its quiet aftermath of survival. Smoke from the hearth drifted lazily upward, curling around the low beams before slipping through the chimney. Michael Grant stirred in his chair, stiff from sleeping upright. The fire had burned low, yet enough warmth lingered to remind him that, against all odds, the night had not claimed them. He blinked toward the blanket near the hearth. Nova lay curled there, her side rising in slow, steady breaths. Her leg, thickly bandaged with strips from his old scarf, looked swollen but clean. The 3 pups were a knot of soft fur pressed close to her belly, their tiny ears twitching in dreams. For a long moment, Michael simply watched. He couldn't remember the last time his cabin had looked alive, when the silence had been filled with something other than the ghosts of memory. He rose carefully, every joint protesting, and poured water from the kettle. The sound of it boiling brought a strange comfort. He hadn't made coffee for anyone but himself in 2 years, and even then it had always tasted like penance. Today, it tasted almost like peace. When he turned back, Nova's eyes were open. The golden brown gaze met his, alert yet calm. "You made it," he murmured, kneeling beside her. "That's something, girl." She blinked slowly, her ears tilting toward his voice. He reached for his med kit, cleaned her wound again, and changed the dressing. "You're a soldier, huh?" he whispered. The faintest wag of her tail answered him. "Then you and I understand each other." After tending to her, he focused on the pups. He warmed milk in a small pan, tested it on his wrist like he remembered his wife doing years ago, and fed them carefully with a spoon. The smallest one, the pale-nosed pup, climbed clumsily onto his knee, licking his glove with a persistence that made him chuckle. All right," he said. "Patience, soldier." He named them without ceremony. The bold one became Ash because of the soot that clung to its fur. The dark, quiet one he called Rook, for the black chess piece he used to play with Eleanor. The gentle, silver-eyed pup he named Willow, after the tree outside the cabin that bent but never broke in the wind. When he looked back at their mother, he nodded slightly. "And you, Nova, the new star." As the day wore on, he built a small enclosure beside the fire, using old crates and blankets, a place for the pups to stay warm. The storm outside had begun to quiet, leaving only the occasional sigh of wind across the roof. Every sound seemed sharper now, the pop of resin in the firewood, the rhythmic breathing of 4 rescued lives, the pulse of something human returning to the cabin. Around noon, Michael stepped outside for the first time since the night before. The world was a canvas of white and gold. Sunlight glimmered off snowbanks, and the air was so crisp it seemed to hum. He shoveled a path to the shed, collected more logs, and returned to find Nova watching him through the window. There was intelligence in her gaze, curiosity, trust, and something else, something that looked almost like gratitude. He spoke to her as he worked, not because he expected an answer, but because silence now felt unnatural. "You probably had a family out there, someone's pet maybe. Or maybe the storm took them. I've seen it before. I've seen a lot of things." He paused, placing another log on the fire. "I wasn't much better than a ghost myself until last night." That evening, as the snow outside began to melt into glassy ice, he sat at the table, sharpening his knife again out of habit. The reflection of the fire flickered across its blade. He thought of Eleanor, her laughter, her steady hands when she'd volunteered at the mountain clinic, the way she always believed broken things could be mended. Nova shifted, her pups squeaking as they sought her warmth. Michael glanced at them, then at the framed photo half hidden under dust on the mantel. He reached for it. The picture showed him and Eleanor years ago, standing before a rescue helicopter, wind in their faces, her hand resting on his shoulder. He brushed the dust away and set it near the hearth. "You'd like them," he whispered. "You always said I needed a reason to keep fighting." The next days fell into a rhythm. Morning light filtered through the pines, and the cabin smelled of wood smoke and boiled oats. Michael cleaned Nova's wound twice a day, each time surprised by how quickly it healed. She began to stand again, though limping, and would follow him a few steps before lying down by the fire. When she wagged her tail for the first time, he grinned like a boy. He repaired the broken window latch, tightened the roof boards, and restocked his supplies, tasks he had neglected since grief hollowed him out. Now they seemed worth doing again. When the pups grew restless, he let them explore under his watchful eye, their clumsy legs slipping on the wooden floor as they chased shadows and tumbled over one another. The sound of their yips filled every corner of the room. By the 5th day, Nova was walking more steadily. She ate from his hand, her head resting against his knee when he sat. The scar along her leg remained angry and red, yet she no longer flinched from the cold. Her spirit, it seemed, had already mended. That evening, as twilight bled into the room, Michael lit a lamp and wrote in his old rescue journal the first words he'd written since Eleanor's death. January 18th. Found 4 lives in the storm. Maybe they found me instead. Her name is Nova. 3 pups, Ash, Rook, Willow. Cabin's warm again. I can hear breathing other than my own. He closed the notebook and stared at the fire, thinking how strange it was that life could return so quietly, like dawn breaking through mist. Later, he noticed Nova watching the window, ears pricked. Outside, snow still fell in lazy spirals. "No one out there, girl," he murmured. "Just the wind." But he followed her gaze anyway, and for a fleeting second, he thought he saw something move, just the shadow of a deer crossing the ridge. Still, the sight made him uneasy. The wilderness was not kind to strays. He checked the traps around his property the next morning. He hadn't set any, but someone else might have. Hunters sometimes wandered too close to the valley. He found 2 rusted snares and dismantled them, tossing the springs into the stream. "No more of that," he muttered. When he returned, Martha Jenkins stood at the edge of his clearing. She was wrapped in a long wool coat, the color of dusted sage. A red scarf wound around her neck. Her silver hair was pinned under a knitted hat, and her cheeks glowed from the cold. Martha had lived in the lower valley for decades, a retired Army nurse who ran the small clinic 2 towns over. She had known Michael once, before the accident. "Michael Grant," she called, smiling faintly. "Didn't think I'd see the day you'd come out of hiding." He hesitated, brushing snow off his gloves. "Wasn't planning on visitors." "Well, I wasn't planning on climbing up this hill either," she said, trudging closer. "But Tom at the store said smoke's been rising from your chimney every day. Thought I'd check if you were alive or just haunting the place." Her humor drew the first real smile from him in months. "Alive, for now." When she stepped inside the cabin, the warmth surprised her. So did the sight of Nova and her pups by the fire. "Good Lord," she breathed, kneeling down. "Where did you find them?" "In the woods," he said quietly. Trap nearly took her leg off. Martha's hands, though older, still moved with the confidence of a medic. She examined the bandage, nodded approvingly. "You did well. She's healing fine." Her eyes lifted to him. "Guess the rescuer in you isn't entirely gone." He looked away, uncomfortable with praise. "Wasn't a choice." "Maybe not," she replied, standing. "But maybe it was a sign. You needed something to save, and God sent you 4 somethings." He almost laughed, but her words stayed with him long after she left. That evening, as the sky turned violet, he sat by the fire, watching Nova nurse her pups. The light flickered over their fur, and for the first time since Eleanor's death, the cabin no longer felt like a tomb. Nova's eyes met his, steady and calm. There was pain there still, but also trust, a mirror of his own reflection. He reached out, brushing her head gently. "You and me, Nova," he said softly. "Looks like we both got a reason now." Outside, snow began to fall again, thin and silent, like blessings descending from a quiet heaven. Inside, the fire burned brighter, and the man who had once buried his heart beneath grief finally felt it beat again. By late February, the storms over Granite Hollow had grown tired of their own violence. The mountains finally exhaled, releasing the valley beneath a pale sun that felt almost like forgiveness. The snow still clung to the shadows, but the air was changing. Less a knife, more a whisper. Down in the hollow, Michael Grant's cabin looked softer now, its roof glistening with slow melting frost. Inside, the rhythm of life had found its fragile pulse. Nova's leg had healed enough for her to stand, though she still favored it with a limp. Her pups, Ash, Rook, and Willow, had transformed from trembling bundles into noisy explorers, tumbling across the wooden floor and gnawing on anything within reach. The sound of their paws clicking against the planks filled the once lonely room with chaos and laughter. Michael moved around the cabin like a man relearning the language of living. He mended broken hinges, hung a kettle above the fire, and even shaved, something he hadn't bothered with in over a year. His beard had been a shield, a declaration that he belonged to no one and nothing. Now, as the blade scraped away months of neglect, the mirror revealed someone he almost recognized. A man still carrying grief, yes, but also carrying light again. That afternoon, the quiet knock on his door startled him. He wasn't used to visitors. His cabin was too far, too hidden. He hesitated, then opened it. There stood Martha Jenkins, her breath puffing in the cold, her cheeks flushed pink. She wore the same wool coat he remembered from years ago when she'd volunteered during avalanche season. A sage-green thing that always smelled faintly of peppermint and pine soap. "Martha," he said, half in disbelief, "you made it up the trail again?" She grinned, brushing snow from her boots. "You didn't think I'd forget my patients, did you? And I brought company." From behind her, a small shape emerged, A gray tabby cat in a wicker basket, blinking at the cold. Found her at the clinic, Martha explained. Her owner passed last month. Thought she might keep you humble. Michael blinked. A cat? Name's June, Martha said cheerfully, stepping inside without waiting for permission. She's quiet, unlike you. He couldn't help a laugh. You always had a strange way of doing charity work. Don't mistake kindness for charity, she said, setting the basket near the hearth. It's for her benefit, not yours. Nova, watching from her blanket, let out a low, uncertain growl. Martha crouched, holding out her hand. Easy now, sweetheart. I've seen eyes like yours before. Her voice softened, the kind that once soothed soldiers on stretchers. Nova sniffed her fingers, then relaxed, pressing her head gently against Martha's palm. Good girl, Martha whispered. You've done well, soldier. Michael smiled faintly at the nickname. You used to call me that too. And you hated it, she said, settling into a chair. But you always showed up when someone needed saving. Seems that hasn't changed. He poured her tea, his first act of hospitality in years. They sat in the dim light of afternoon, the fire popping softly. The smell of pine and boiled herbs filled the air. Outside, wind rustled through the branches like an old hymn. You look better, Martha said finally. There's color in your face again. I've been busy, he replied. Hard to sulk when you've got 4 mouths to feed. 4? She glanced at June, who had climbed onto the windowsill, staring out at the pale sky. Make that 5. He chuckled, shaking his head. Don't start counting me as part of the herd. Oh, I would never insult Nova like that, she teased, then added more seriously. I'm proud of you, Michael. I was worried for a while. After Eleanor... He froze slightly, but Martha's eyes were kind, steady and knowing. You were in pieces, she continued softly. I saw men come back from war with the same emptiness. They'd survived, but they hadn't returned. Michael stared into his tea. I didn't think I'd ever come back either. Then one night, the storm hit, and I heard that cry. Martha's gaze flicked toward Nova. Sometimes God doesn't send angels. Sometimes he sends a voice in the dark, just loud enough for you to follow. He looked at her, words caught in his throat. For a long moment, there was only the sound of the fire and the pups wrestling on the floor. When Martha finally rose to leave, dusk had begun to creep through the pines. I'll come again next week, she said, wrapping her scarf tighter. Bring more supplies, and maybe a few treats for the troops. He followed her to the door. You don't have to. I know, she interrupted gently. But I want to. Before she stepped outside, she placed a hand on his arm. Keep that fire burning, Michael, not just this one. Her eyes darted to his chest. That one too. Then she was gone, her figure swallowed by the pale blue dusk. Michael stood in the doorway long after she disappeared, the wind tugging at his sleeves. He watched the light fade across the valley. The same valley that had once felt like his prison now looked almost like sanctuary. When he turned back, Nova was standing on 3 legs, tail wagging faintly. She limped to his side, pressing against his leg as if to ask whether everything was all right. We're fine, he said, ruffling her fur. Just fine. That night, the cabin glowed like a lantern against the snow. Michael sat at the table, writing again in his journal. February 26th. Martha came, brought a cat, talked too much truth for one visit. Nova's walking better. Pups are trouble, but good trouble. It's strange how the house doesn't echo anymore. He paused, tapping the pen. Outside, a soft whimper rose. The pups tangled in. Their blanket again. Nova nudged them into place, her patience infinite. He smiled. Later, as he stoked the fire, June the cat jumped onto the windowsill again. The glow from the hearth painted her fur amber. Her tail twitched, ears perked. Michael followed her gaze and frowned. Through the frosted glass, he thought he saw something move near the tree line, a flash of brown fur, quick and low. Maybe a fox, maybe nothing. But Nova noticed it too, lifting her head, ears sharp. Just the wild calling, he said quietly. Nothing to fear. Yet part of him knew better. The forest always remembered its own. In the following days, Martha returned several times, bringing soup, medicine, and laughter that filled corners the fire could not reach. She told stories about her late husband, a kind man who'd taught her to fix radios and never to curse during blizzards. Swearing at the weather doesn't make it stop snowing, she'd say, smiling. Michael listened, sometimes smiling, sometimes just letting her words wash over him like sunlight. Slowly, a fragile friendship grew again, woven from shared silences, and the simple kindness of showing up. Nova began walking outside with him, testing her healed leg in the snow. The pups followed clumsily, barking at birds and chasing each other's tails. The sight made Martha laugh the first time she saw it. "You've got a whole army now," she said. He nodded, eyes following the dogs. "Feels more like a family." By mid-March, the snow melted into patches of earth. Streams began to sing again beneath the ice. Michael built a small pen outside for the dogs, chopping old timber into posts. The air smelled of pine and thawing soil. For the first time in years, he caught himself humming while he worked. But one evening, as he sat by the fire with Martha, watching the pups sleep, she said softly, "You know, they won't stay forever." He looked up, startled. "What do you mean?" "Animals like Nova, they belong to the wild, even when they love us." He glanced at Nova, lying near the hearth, eyes half closed, but ears still tuned to the distant forest. He knew Martha was right. Something in the dog's posture, alert, restless, hinted at the pull of freedom. "She'll leave when it's time," Martha continued gently. "And when she does, you'll know she left because you gave her enough love to heal." Michael swallowed hard. "I don't know if I can lose them too." Martha's voice softened to a whisper. "You won't lose them, Michael. Love doesn't vanish. It just changes form." Outside, the last snow of the season began to fall, thin and feathery, like the memory of winter saying goodbye. Inside, the man who once couldn't bear company now shared tea, laughter, and the quiet warmth of 4 hearts that had found their way to his door. That night, before sleep claimed him, Michael looked at Nova resting near the fire, her pups curled close. He whispered, "Maybe you're right, Martha. Maybe they were sent here for a reason." The wind outside rustled softly through the pines, carrying the faint echo of something that sounded very much like an answer. The thaw came slowly to Granite Hollow, as though the land itself was reluctant to let go of its sorrow. For months the snow had buried everything, paths, fences, even memories. And now it melted in patient rivulets that whispered down the hillsides. The forest, stripped and skeletal, began to breathe again. Beneath the pine boughs, shoots of green fought through the remnants of white. Michael Grant stood outside his cabin, axe resting against his shoulder, watching the sun crawl higher over the ridge. The light touched the world differently now, gentler, almost curious. His cabin no longer looked like a refuge for ghosts, but a place where something new might grow. Nova sat beside him, her fur glinting gold beneath the morning light. Her limp had faded to a faint stiffness, a scar of survival. The 3 pups, Ash, Rook, and Willow, tumbled through the melting snow, chasing a drifting feather as though it were a miracle. Their barks echoed across the clearing, sharp and alive. It had been nearly a month since the last storm. The rhythm of life had changed once more. Michael's days were filled with small labors, repairing fences, splitting wood, and making space for life again. Each task felt lighter now, not a punishment for existing, but a quiet affirmation of it. He had even begun whistling, a sound so foreign that it startled the birds back to song. Martha Jenkins still came by every few days, carrying supplies or an excuse to check on him. Her face, framed by silver curls, carried the calm wisdom of someone who had weathered too many kinds of storms. "You've turned this place around," she said one afternoon, surveying the cabin as if it were a patient she'd nursed back from the edge. Michael shrugged. "Didn't have much choice. These 4 keep me on my feet." Martha smiled, her gaze softening on Nova and the pups sprawled in the sun. "You're doing more than keeping on your feet, Michael. You're living again." He didn't answer. Words sometimes felt too fragile to hold the truth. But when he looked at Nova, her watchful eyes, her steady presence, he knew Martha was right. Something had healed in him, even if the wound itself still existed. That evening, after Martha had left and the valley turned the color of embers, Michael sat on the porch with a cup of coffee. The pups were asleep in a tangled heap near the door. Nova lay beside them, her gaze fixed on the darkening forest. There was a stillness in her posture, the kind that came not from peace but from listening. "What do you hear, girl?" he asked softly. She turned her head toward him briefly, then back to the trees. The faintest breeze stirred, carrying with it the scent of pine and something wilder, something that didn't belong to this little clearing of warmth and wood smoke. That night, he dreamed of running, through endless snow, through wind that cut and carried voices not his own. When he woke, the cabin was quiet except for the crackle of the dying fire. He rose, uneasy, and glanced toward Nova's blanket. She was awake, eyes gleaming in the dim light. "Couldn't sleep either?" he murmured. She gave a low whine, pressing her nose against his hand. Her warmth grounded him, but her gaze, steady, knowing, filled him with an ache he couldn't name. The next morning dawned bright, the snow almost gone. Michael worked in the yard, mending the small pen he'd built for the dogs. He hammered in silence, lost in thought, until he noticed Nova standing near the edge of the forest. Her ears were pricked forward, tail low but wagging slowly. "Hey," he called, "don't go too far." She turned, meeting his eyes for a long moment, and then looked back toward the trees. Ash and Rook bounded after her, yipping. Willow hesitated, then followed. Michael dropped his hammer, walking closer. "Nova," he said softly, "come back." But something had shifted. The forest seemed to pull her, whispering in a language older than love. She took a few steps forward, then paused, glancing over her shoulder. Michael stopped at the edge of the clearing. The air felt thick, like the moment before a storm. He understood what was happening before it truly began. He crouched, voice low and even. "If the wild's calling, girl, you go." Nova approached him, slow and deliberate. She pressed her head against his chest, a gesture so human it nearly broke him. He ran his hands through her fur, memorizing every line, every breath. "Thank you," he whispered, "for staying as long as you did." She pulled back, eyes gleaming like amber in the sun. Then, with one final look, she turned and loped into the trees, the pups bounding after her, clumsy and bright. Michael watched until the last flicker of movement vanished into the forest. The silence that followed was deep, alive, and unbearably tender. He stayed there for a long time, kneeling in the mud, staring at the space where they had disappeared. The forest stood indifferent, ancient, and yet it felt as though the entire valley was holding its breath. That night, the cabin was quieter than it had been in months. The empty space where their blanket had been seemed enormous. The air felt thinner, colder. He stoked the fire out of habit, poured himself coffee, then let it go cold untouched. Every sound, the creak of wood, the wind against the shutters, seemed to echo too loudly. Still, he didn't cry. Grief had changed shape inside him. It no longer demanded to be fought or denied. Instead, it simply existed, a hollow that could hold both pain and gratitude at once. He took up his journal before bed, the ink trembling slightly on the page. March 10th. Nova left today. She took the little ones with her. I knew it was coming. The wild doesn't ask permission. Funny thing, when they left, the cabin didn't feel empty. It felt full, like the silence was a promise, not an absence. He closed the notebook and set it on the table. The firelight flickered against the wall, painting the room in gold and shadow. He looked toward the door once more, half expecting to hear the soft patter of paws. But there was nothing, only wind and memory. Outside, the snowmelt whispered through the earth, finding its way to the streams below. Somewhere beyond the trees, Nova led her young through the wide, wild world she was born for. And in the cabin she had left behind, Michael sat in the quiet glow of a life reshaped. He leaned back in his chair, letting the warmth of the fire sink into his bones. The stillness was no longer his enemy. It was something sacred, a space in which the heart could remember without breaking. He whispered into the silence, not sure if the words were prayer or farewell. "Run free, girl, and come home if you ever can." The wind sighed through the chimney, gentle as a reply. The last breath of winter came without warning. A sudden wind swept through Granite Hollow, carrying the sharp scent of snow. By dusk, clouds rolled over the mountains like an army returning for one final march. Michael Grant, standing outside his cabin, could feel it in his bones, the kind of cold that reached beyond skin and memory. He had spent the afternoon repairing the fence by the stream, the one Nova used to cross with her pups. Even now, he found himself glancing at the tree line, half expecting to see a flicker of fur or hear the familiar bark that had once filled the valley. But the forest remained silent, only the sighing of wind and the faint creak of pines. When the first flakes began to fall, he returned inside, bolting the door against the storm. The fire burned bright, the cabin warm, yet loneliness drifted through the air like smoke. On the mantel sat a photograph, Nova, her pups, and Michael, taken weeks before they left. Martha had insisted on capturing the family of miracles, as she called them. Michael smiled faintly at the memory, then he coughed, a dry hacking sound that caught him by surprise. The room tilted for a moment, and he steadied himself against the table. "Just a chill," he muttered, but by nightfall, fever crept through him like fire under his skin. The storm worsened. Wind battered the windows, rattling the shutters like desperate hands. Michael tried to reach for his coat, thinking he could fetch more wood, but the world blurred, his strength draining fast. He fell to his knees beside the hearth, breath coming in shallow bursts. In the haze of fever, the storm's howl began to change. It grew rhythmic, familiar, like a sound he had once heard in a dream. A scratching, faint but steady, came from the door. Then a whimper, then another. Michael forced his eyes open. "No," he whispered, disbelieving. He crawled toward the door, his hands trembling as he unlatched it. Snow burst in, swirling around him, and there, outlined against the blinding white, stood Nova. Her fur, thick and dusted with frost, shimmered in the dim light. Behind her, three shapes moved, Ash, Rook, and Willow. No longer small, but nearly grown, strong and lean. For a second, Michael thought it was another fevered vision. But then, Nova stepped forward, pressed her head against his chest, and let out a low, familiar sound. A sound that said, "We're home." His breath caught. "You came back," he rasped. "You really came back." Nova licked his chin, her eyes sharp with recognition. The pups, no longer clumsy, circled him, their warmth pressing against his sides. He could feel the heat of their bodies, hear the thump of their tails against the wooden floor. "Good girl," he murmured, voice breaking. "Good girl, Nova." They stayed close to him through the night. He lay on the floor beside the fire, shivering, the fever climbing, but Nova refused to move. She rested her head across his arm, eyes glowing faintly in the firelight. The pups curled around him, their breaths rising and falling in a circle of warmth. Outside, the storm howled and clawed at the roof. But inside, the cabin became a cocoon of life, flames, fur, and faith. Every time Michael drifted toward darkness, he felt Nova's weight beside him, the steady rhythm of her heartbeat tethering him back to the world. In his half-conscious state, he dreamed of Eleanor standing at the edge of the woods, smiling. "You're not alone anymore," she said. "You never were." When dawn came, the storm had passed. The light filtering through the window was soft, golden. Michael stirred, every muscle heavy but alive. His fever had broken. The fire had burned low, but the air was warm, too warm for the dying embers to have done it alone. He looked down. Nova was still there, eyes closed, breathing slow and steady. The pup stirred as he moved, yawning and stretching, before curling back up. He reached out, brushing her fur gently. "You saved me," he whispered. She opened her eyes, meeting his gaze, and wagged her tail once. Then, with effort, she stood, limped to the door, and looked back as if to ask permission. "You want out?" he asked softly. "All right." He opened the door. The world outside was unrecognizable, a landscape remade by snow and light. The trees sparkled under sheets of ice, and the air hummed with a silence so deep it felt sacred. Nova stepped into the snow, her pups following close behind. They paused for a moment, each of them turning back toward him. Their breath rose like smoke in the morning air. "Go on," he said, smiling through tears. "Go on, before I start crying again." They disappeared into the woods, their shapes fading into the brilliance of dawn. Later that day, Martha arrived. The road had been nearly impassable, but she had driven through anyway, a pot of soup rattling in her truck bed. When she burst through the cabin door, she stopped short, eyes wide. "You look half dead," she said, setting down her coat. "Not dead yet," he replied hoarsely, managing a grin. She checked his forehead, then his pulse, scolding him under her breath. "You should have called." "Couldn't," he said simply. "Storm cut the line. Martha noticed the paw prints leading from the door into the forest. Her expression softened. They came back, didn't they? Michael nodded. Just when I needed them most. She smiled gently. Maybe God decided you needed a reminder. He looked toward the window. The forest gleamed in the light, silent and alive. I think he sent it right on time. That evening, after Martha left, Michael sat once more by the fire. The storm had taken something from him, but given more in return, a truth carved deep into his soul. He opened his journal and began to write. April 2nd. The storm returned, but so did they. Nova and her pups. They found me half gone and brought me back. Maybe that's what miracles look like, not thunder or light, but fur, breath, and loyalty. When I first found them, I thought I was saving their lives. Now I know they were sent to save mine. He set down the pen and leaned back, closing his eyes. The fire crackled softly, casting shadows that danced like old friends across the walls. Outside, somewhere beyond the trees, a faint howl echoed, low, long, and peaceful. He smiled. I hear you, girl, he murmured. I hear you. And in the hush that followed, the snow began to melt. Spring came quietly to Granite Hollow, not as a sudden burst of color, but as a slow, tender unfolding. The snow retreated inch by inch, revealing a valley that looked new yet ancient, washed clean by storms and silence. Streams murmured again through the forest, carrying with them the faint scent of pine and thawing earth. Birds returned first, stitching music back into the sky, and then came the light, soft, golden, forgiving. Michael Grant stood on his porch, hands braced on the railing, watching as the morning mist curled away from the trees. The valley below shimmered, alive with the promise of another season. He had survived the long winter. And more than that, he had been changed by it. The cabin behind him looked different too. The once cracked window now gleamed with new glass. The roof no longer sagged under its burden. The scent of fresh timber still lingered from where he had replaced the rotten boards. Yet the greatest change could not be measured in repairs or paint. It was in the air, in the warmth that seemed to breathe through every corner. Inside, a photo sat framed on the mantel, Nova and her pups, Martha smiling beside them, sunlight streaming through the doorway. It had been taken the week before Nova disappeared into the woods for good. Michael had kept it there as a reminder, not of loss, but of love that had done its job. He moved through the cabin with quiet purpose. Each morning began the same now. He boiled water, fed June the cat, still as aloof and dignified as the day Martha brought her, and wrote a few lines in his journal before heading outside. There were fences to mend, trees to plant, a garden to start. Martha had insisted on the garden. Every man needs something to tend, she'd said. It keeps the soul honest. The earth was stubborn at first, but Michael worked patiently. He turned the soil, scattering seeds of carrots, beans, and sunflowers. It felt strange, almost holy, to create life in the same ground where he once buried despair. The sound of the shovel in the dirt was steady, rhythmic, like the beat of a heart long dormant but finally awake. One afternoon, as he wiped sweat from his brow, a familiar crunch of gravel reached his ears. He turned and smiled. Martha Jenkins was making her way up the hill, a wicker basket on her arm. Her silver hair caught the sun like spun glass. You always know when to show up, he called. I always did have good timing, she said with a grin, setting the basket on the porch. I brought stew and bread. You still forget to eat like a normal person, don't you? Sometimes, he admitted. Thought so. She entered the cabin, her gaze landing on the photo above the hearth. You've been keeping the place well. He nodded. Trying to. They ate together by the fire as the sun dipped behind the ridge. Martha talked about the valley, how the clinic was busier now that spring had returned, how the deer were venturing lower to graze. Michael listened, occasionally smiling, occasionally lost in thought. When she noticed his silence, she said gently, You still think about them, don't you? Every day, he replied. But it's different now. I used to miss them like an open wound. Now, it's more like a scar I don't want to heal. Martha nodded, eyes soft. That's what love does. It stays, even after the leaving. He smiled faintly. You always sound like a preacher. I prefer wise woman, she said, winking. Then, after a pause, she added, You should write her story down someday. Nova's yours. Someone might need it. I've started, he said quietly, gesturing to his journal on the table. It helps me remember what matters. The evening settled around them like a worn blanket. When Martha left, the world outside had turned blue and gold. Michael stood at the porch, watching her car disappear down the hill, and for a long time, he simply listened. To the wind, to the distant call of an owl, to the silence that no longer frightened him. The days that followed passed with quiet grace. The garden sprouted, the cabin filled with light. June the cat began to nap by the open window, purring in her sleep. Michael wrote more, about the storms, the dogs, the night the ice spoke. He wrote about finding hope in a place he thought barren, and though he never planned to share it, the act of writing itself felt like a kind of prayer. One morning, as he tended the garden, a sound caught his ear. Soft, almost imperceptible. He turned toward the forest. There, standing at the edge of the clearing, was a figure he had not seen in weeks. Nova. She was thinner now, older, but her coat gleamed in the light, and her eyes, those same steady golden eyes, met his across the field. Behind her stood one of her grown pups, tail swaying, watching quietly. Michael froze, afraid to move, afraid that even breathing might shatter the moment. Then he smiled, slow, incredulous. "Hey there, girl." Nova tilted her head, as if acknowledging the greeting. She took one step forward, then stopped. The young dog behind her let out a small bark, impatient, eager. "It's all right," he said softly, voice trembling. "You don't have to stay. I just needed to see you were okay." For a heartbeat, the world held still. The wind rustled through the leaves, a single ray of sunlight cutting through the clearing like a blessing. Nova gave a small huff, not quite a bark, not quite a sigh, and turned back toward the trees. The younger dog followed, pausing only to glance once more at the man by the garden. Then they vanished into the green. Michael stood there long after they were gone, the warmth of the sun mixing with the sting of tears he didn't bother to hide. "Goodbye," he whispered, "and thank you." That night, he sat at his desk under the lamplight, pen in hand, and wrote the final entry in his journal. April 25th. She came back, just for a moment, long enough for me to know she's free. Maybe that's what love really is, not holding on, but letting go when the time is right. I thought I saved 4 lives that winter, but it turns out they were sent to save mine. God's miracles don't always roar. Sometimes they walk on 4 paws and find you in the storm. He closed the journal and looked around the cabin. The firelight danced on the walls, warm and steady. On the table, Martha's basket sat half full of bread and fruit. On the windowsill, June lifted her head, blinking at him before curling back to sleep. Michael walked to the door, opened it, and stepped outside. The night was cool but kind. Stars glittered above the valley, their reflections shimmering in the streams below. Somewhere far away, a faint howl rose, soft, strong, eternal. He smiled. "Good night, Nova," he said quietly. And as he turned back toward the cabin, smoke rose gently from the chimney, glowing gold against the dark. It was no longer a house of grief, but a house of light, a place reborn from the storm, where hope had learned to stay. The camera of the world would have pulled away then, rising slowly into the twilight. From above, Granite Hollow shimmered, a single cabin nestled in a sea of green and silver, its chimney painting a thin column of light toward heaven. Sometimes, the greatest miracles are not the ones that split the sky or move mountains, but the quiet ones that walk beside us when we think we are alone. Just like Michael and Nova, God often sends help in the form of love, loyalty, and small signs that remind us He never forgets us. Every sunrise, every heartbeat, every second chance is proof that His grace is still alive in our lives. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment below, tell us how it made you feel, and do not forget to subscribe for more stories of faith, love, and redemption. May God bless you and your family with peace, courage, and light through every storm. Type Amen if you believe miracles still happen every day.